Back in the days before GPS, if I were traveling to Joe's house and I got lost, I would pick up my trusty phone, call him and say, "Joe, good buddy, I seem to have taken a few wrong turns. Could you give me directions to your place?" Now, what should be the first thing that he would say to me?
Where are you?
"Where are you now?" Madam Toastmaster, fellow members and guests, the phrase, "where are we now," can be used in a whole host of situations. It can be used in getting our bearings going from point A to point B. But even if the destination isn't fully known, or there are multiple possible destinations, couldn't we at least get some idea of where we might end up if we know where we are now? Then, perhaps, course adjustments could be made. The concepts I want to share with you tonight were from a recent article by Robert Kiyosaki, author of Rich Dad, Poor Dad. In it, he cites the work of a little-known historian, Alexander Tytler, who died in 1813. So let's take a trip together, and instead of going to a winery, let's take a trip back in history and follow Tytler's theses forward and see if we can answer the question of, where are we now? Tytler studied democracies that existed throughout history because he was very skeptical of them. His work led him to the conclusion that the average life expectancy of democracy throughout history was 200 years. His basic premise was that a democracy can exist until the time the voters discover that they can vote themselves generous gifts from the treasury. From that point on, the majority always votes for whichever candidate promises them the most free gifts, with the result that every democracy will collapse due to loose fiscal policy. Let's continue our journey through the 8 stages that Tytler said every democracy followed. From bondage to spiritual faith, from faith to courage, from courage to liberty, from liberty to abundance, from abundance to complacency, from complacency to apathy, from apathy to dependence, from dependence back to bondage. Can we answer this question, where are we now? Mr. Kiyosaki then provides his explanation of this evolution. The Pilgrims left England to escape what they considered to be religious bondage. Their courage caused them to come here, in spite of not only the dangers of the voyage in getting here, but not knowing what hazards they would face once they got here. And in fact, conditions here were terrible. In 1607, 70 of the 108 settlers died. As the colonies grew, their faith, along with the hardships they endured, brought them courage. Once their bare necessities were met, they became more upset at what they considered to be injustices perpetrated upon them by the crown. By declaring their independence from England, they knew it meant war, and they were willing to fight for it. Their courage, through the sufferings like at Valley Forge, and their ultimate victory, resulted in liberty. Granted, not for everyone immediately, but it certainly took a great deal of courage for that to occur at a later date. Then, for over 150 years, our nation grew and prospered. After World War II, we were the undisputed economic and military power in the world, due in part to not having the homeland touched by war. Our factories churned out everything we, as well as the rest of the world, could possibly want. Clearly, we were blessed with abundance. I suppose it's human nature that when things are going well, that a little bit of complacency sets into our everyday lives. But when it becomes institutionalized, it can sometimes destroy our collective will. Consider what we were asked to do after 9/11 and what FDR asked us to do after Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt motivated us and said we would fight on to the ultimate victory. President Bush said the best thing we could do for our country was to go shopping. Apathy. If you want to see apathy, stand around a polling place during a school election or a millage election. Even in national elections, we consider 60% turnout to be great and speculate that it will be even lower if the weather is bad. Then, through years of monetary and fiscal policies decisions, we went from being a producing nation to a consuming nation. Rather than produce, we borrowed and printed money to maintain our standard of living. Today, we are dependent on foreign nations to finance that debt. Many of these nations clearly do not have our best interests at heart. Many people today are also more dependent upon the government to take care of them. Even talk of raising the retirement age by 2 years, by 2075, is met with calls of protest. Now, how many of you are overly concerned that by 2075 you might get to retire a bit later than you had thought? If you've ever signed up for a government program or dealt with the IRS, you know the Byzantine procedures you must follow to get any benefits. In addition, you must follow their rules if you expect to get their support. So in a sense, you've given up some of your freedom for the security of this program. Now, is it conceivable that a nation that was born by declaring its independence from a foreign government and fighting to obtain it will join the list of formerly great nations by gladly and willfully declaring its overwhelming dependence on its own government? So exactly where are we on this journey we've taken through history? I would propose that we've come to a fork in the road. It's up to us to determine where this journey ends. Do we choose the path that proves that everything Alexander Tytler said about democracies was correct? Or are we still that shining city on a hill, the gleaming exception to Tytler's premise? Is it still morning in America, or is it twilight? The answer must come from each of us. It will require sacrifice, difficult, and probably unpopular solutions. Is it all worth the trouble? Is America worth it? I certainly think it is. I'd like to leave you with these words that may gird us for the challenges we will face. They're set at another pivotal point in our history by a man who always seemed to find the right words as the occasion required, and who certainly had his share of crises to deal with. In 1862, President Lincoln spoke to Congress after a string of defeats on the battlefield had caused our resolve to falter. His words are as relevant today as they were then. Fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. The trial through which we pass will light us down, in honor or dishonor, to the latest generation. We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope of earth. Madam Toastmaster.